March 24th, 1945. The sky over Berlin had become a graveyard of metal. Thousands of American B-17 bombers were pushing toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The crews of these flying fortresses had seen it all. Flak, hundreds of fighters, even head-on rammings. But on this day, they heard a sound that made even the veterans' blood run cold. It wasn't the familiar roar of piston engines. It was a piercing whistle, like a giant gas torch. Through the clouds, at a speed that seemed physically impossible, silhouettes without propellers streaked by. They were triangular, predatory, looking more like sharks than planes. These were the Messerschmitt 262s, the world's first operational jet fighters. Hitler's secret weapon, intended to turn the tide of the war at the very last moment. The situation in the sky looked like an execution. The German jets were accelerating to 540 miles per hour. The American P-51 Mustang escorts could barely hit 440. This wasn't just a gap in numbers. It was a chasm between eras. By all laws of aerodynamics, the outcome was predetermined. The German pilots, the elite of the Luftwaffe, felt invincible. They could strike, zoom upward, and vanish before the Americans could even turn their guns. The bombers began to fall, one by one. The radio filled with cries for help. It seemed there was no escape. But suddenly, through the formation of panicking planes, a flight of Mustangs emerged. They were different from all the others. Their tails were painted in a defiant, bright red. Instead of evading or trying to hopelessly chase the jet monsters, these pilots did something suicidal. They turned their old, slow machines directly towards supersonic death. In the cockpit of one P-51 sat a pilot who knew he had only a fraction of a second. A window of opportunity where the trajectories of the two planes would intersect. If he missed, the jet would be gone. If he hesitated, he was dead. Mathematics said, "Do not fire. The angular velocity is too high." Instinct screamed, "Strike now." 6 50 caliber machine guns thundered simultaneously. A wall of lead met the skin of the jet engine. The impossible happened. The invincible fighter of the future exploded in midair, raining burning debris over the Berlin suburbs. On that day, not one jet fell, but 3. The German aces, who managed to parachute out, descended to the ground in total disbelief. Their advanced technology, their pride, their miracle weapon had been destroyed by planes of the previous generation. But the real shock lay ahead, when they learned exactly who was behind the sticks of those red-tailed machines. Nazi ideology had taught them they were fighting racially inferior opponents, that black men were incapable of complex technical actions and lacked the reflexes or intelligence to fly a fighter. Yet these were the very men who had just taught the master race a lesson in aerodynamics that cost millions of Reichmarks. How did this happen? How did a group of pilots, whom their own country had deemed unfit for flight, become the most effective shield in the history of American aviation? To find the answer, we must leave the skies of Berlin and descend to the ground, into a smoke-filled office of the American military headquarters, where 20 years before this battle, a single document was written, a document that was supposed to guarantee these men would never take to the air. In the archives of the Pentagon, a report dated 1925 was kept for a long time. It wasn't a propaganda leaflet or an emotional speech. It was a dry academic document prepared by the U.S. Army War College. The title sounded harmless: The Use of Negro Manpower in War. But the content of this report became the foundation upon which the military aviation policy of that time was built. The generals and scientists, sitting in comfortable chairs with figures and charts in hand, came to a definitive conclusion. African Americans, in their view, were biologically incapable of complex actions. The text claimed that a black man was by nature cowardly, possessed a low level of intelligence, and most importantly, lacked the qualities necessary for a pilot: reaction speed and the ability to make decisions in high-stress situations. This was the science of that era. It was considered a fact that the nervous systems of these men simply could not withstand the G-forces of aerial combat. They were assigned the roles of truck drivers, cooks, or laborers, never officers, and certainly not the elite of the sky. When World War II began and America needed thousands of pilots, the recruitment doors opened for everyone except one group of citizens. If you were a black man dreaming of flight, your dream shattered not against a medical board, but against that same paper from 1925. This is the concept of the double doubt that the future heroes faced. On one side, an external enemy in Nazi Germany who openly called them subhuman. On the other side, their own government telling them they simply weren't built for this. However, pressure was mounting. In the end, Washington made a decision that looked like a concession, but was actually more like an experiment. It was decided to create a single flight program for African Americans in a place called Tuskegee, Alabama. In 1941, Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, visited Tuskegee. Despite the protests of Secret Service guards, she simply approached a plane and asked a black instructor named Charles Anderson to take her up. They were in the air for 40 minutes. When they landed, Eleanor smiled and said a phrase that hit every newspaper. "Well, you can fly just as well as anyone else." That photo, the first lady in a cockpit with a black pilot, traveled the world. There was no turning back. The program was greenlit, but the military leadership, forced to obey an order from above, decided to turn Tuskegee into a brutal filter. The logic was cynical. We will give them planes, and we will watch them fail. The standards set for the cadets at Tuskegee were not just high. They were astronomical. Experts were certain the experiment would end in a series of accidents and a quiet closure of the program. But they never asked the pilots what they were willing to endure for the sky. The cadets decided to use this skepticism as fuel. They understood that a white cadet has the right to make a mistake. If a cadet at Tuskegee made a mistake, it would be used as proof that the 1925 report was right. They weren't just learning to fly. They were learning to survive a system designed for their failure. Welcome to Moton Field, Alabama, summer of '42. Here, among the cotton fields, a drama was unfolding. This was a laboratory where people were tested to their breaking point. The cadets arriving here were the best of the best. Many already had degrees in engineering or mathematics. They were intellectually superior to the average recruit. But here, their degrees meant nothing. Instructors didn't make concessions. On the contrary, they tightened the screws. The curriculum was compressed. Theory, navigation, meteorology. The volume of information was colossal. In the air, a cadet was alone with the Stearman biplane. It was a sturdy but demanding aircraft. Any mistake in piloting was visible from the ground. And here, the brutal law of Tuskegee came into play. If a white cadet on another base had a hard landing, he might be told, "It's okay, son. Try again." If a cadet at Tuskegee had a hard landing, it was seen as confirmation of professional unfitness. The pressure was psychological. Each of these men knew he carried the responsibility for an entire race. One of the pilots later remembered, "We flew as if the devil himself was sitting behind us, recording every move." This created a unique culture of perfectionism. They memorized maps until they could draw them from memory with their eyes closed. They took apart engines and put them back together to understand mechanics better than the technicians. One extra degree of bank on an exam meant more than a bad grade. It meant the end of a dream for a generation. So they didn't allow themselves that extra degree. Slowly, the instructors began to notice something strange. These men flew cleaner and more precisely than graduates of elite academies. In March 1942, the first group received their silver wings. History was made. The wall was breached. The U.S. Army officially had the 99th Fighter Squadron. Command still didn't know what to do with them. In 1943, the decision was made to send them to North Africa. But even here, there was a surprise. They weren't given the newest Thunderbolts or Lightnings. They were given the discarded, obsolete P-40 Warhawks. Heavy, slow machines that were already considered veterans of past battles. The pilots of the 99th looked at their old planes, looked at each other, and took their seats. They had waited too long to complain about the tech. They didn't know that in the desert skies, they weren't waiting for practice targets, but the best aces of the Luftwaffe. North Africa and Italy, 1943. A place where the romance of aviation dies, yielding to the brutal mathematics of war. The 99th Squadron arrived armed with enthusiasm and P-40 Warhawks. By 1943, the P-40 was like a heavyweight boxer entering the ring against a martial arts master. It was tough, but hopelessly slow compared to the nimble German fighters. The German pilots patrolling this sector were veterans. When they saw the newcomers in outdated tech, they likely rubbed their hands in anticipation of an easy hunt. It was then that the first acquaintance occurred. German pilots, flying closer, noticed the skin color of their opponents. For Nazi ideology, this was a glitch in the matrix. German radio began to broadcast a new nickname, Schwarze Vogelmenschen, Black Birdmen. At first, it sounded like a mockery. Germans attacked these flights with curiosity and contempt, expecting panic and disorderly flight. But flight did not happen. The Tuskegee pilots quickly realized their tech was inferior. P-40S couldn't outturn a Messerschmitt or outclimb it. Only one thing remained: discipline. They developed a tactic they followed fanatically. Never stay alone. Always work in pairs. If one attacks, the second covers the tail. This sounds like aviation basics, but in the heat of battle, many forgot this for personal glory. The Tuskegee pilots did not forget. They had no right to be selfish. German radio claimed these pilots were savages, yet in the crosshairs of a German ace, these savages performed maneuvers with the precision of Swiss watches. Second Lieutenant Charles Hall became the first to score. In a brutal fight over Sicily, he caught a Focke-Wulf 190 in his sights, a plane that was technically a head above his own. A short burst. The German fighter crashed into the sea. This was the first crack in the wall of distrust. The Germans' attitude began to change as well. The mocking Birdmen on the radio was replaced by anxious warnings. They realized these men fought with the fury of those who had nothing to lose but their wings. The pilots proved they were masters of the P-40, squeezing 110% of its capabilities. But the U.S. Air Force Command was preparing a new strategy. Massive bombings of Germany were beginning. They needed escort groups capable of accompanying bombers into the deepest raids. For such a mission, the P-40 was useless. They needed a plane that could fly high, far, and hit hard. The headquarters looked at the statistics of the 99th, their discipline, their low loss rate. They decided to give them the best in the American arsenal. The P-51 Mustang, the Cadillac of the skies. The pilots were moved to a new base. Before them on the runway stood shimmering silver machines. Powerful, fast, deadly. Now they had tech equal to their skill. They only had to do one thing: announce their presence. Usually, fighters tried to blend with the sky. Camouflage, gray tones. Any bright detail was a gift for an enemy gunner. To be visible was to be dead. But Colonel Benjamin Davis thought differently. He understood the psychology of war. They didn't need to hide. They needed to make a statement. Technicians on the airfield took brushes and buckets of the brightest crimson paint. They began to systematically paint the tail section of every Mustang a deep blood red. This was not just an identification mark. It was a challenge. It was anti-camouflage. In aerial combat, where every second is a deadly game of hide and seek, they decided to turn on a searchlight and point it at themselves. The message was twofold. For the Germans, this red color meant, "We are here. We are not afraid, and we are not hiding in the clouds. It was a psychological slap to the Luftwaffe. You called us birds? Fine. Now you see our plumage. But there was a second message. For their own. American B-17 and B-24 bombers were suffering horrifying losses. Bomber crews felt like they were on death row. When fighters approached, gunners often opened fire out of fear, unable to distinguish friend from foe. The red tails were to be a beacon of calm. Bomber pilots needed to know, if you see red, you are safe. It was a bold decision. Paint doesn't provide armor or speed. By itself, red paint could have turned them into easy targets for German aces. To make this symbol work, they had to fill it with meaning. They had to ensure that the enemy associated this color with inevitable death, and friends associated it with absolute protection. And the Red Tails did it. Not with paint, but with how they fought. They completely rewrote the rules of escorting, making a sacrifice that other white squadrons were not prepared to make. While the technicians washed the red stains from their hands, Colonel Davis drew a new battle scheme on the blackboard. It was simple, boring, and brilliant. This scheme would turn the Red Tails into a legend that bomber crews would pray for. To understand the greatness of what the Red Tails did, you need to know a dirty secret of aerial war. Being a fighter pilot is a job for egoists. In any army, the measure of success was the tally of downed planes. Kill 5, you're an ace. Your photo is in the papers, you get medals. This created a deadly problem. When German Messerschmitts attacked a bomber formation, American escort fighters often abandoned their charges. Seeing a German plane, they would hit the gas and go on a chase, dreaming of painting another swastika on their fuselage. The Germans knew this. They used bait tactics. A pair of fighters would dive, drawing the guards away. As soon as the American fighters flew off chasing easy prey, a pack of wolves would descend on the defenseless bombers. Colonel Benjamin Davis gathered his pilots and said something that went against the entire culture of fighter aviation. Our task is not to shoot down Germans. Our task is for the bombers to get home. He introduced a brutal rule. Stay with the bombers. If you chase the enemy and break formation, you will face a court-martial, even if you shoot down 3. For young men dreaming of heroism, it sounded like a sentence. They were forbidden from hunting. They were ordered to be a shield. But this iron discipline turned them into a legend. Imagine you are a gunner in the top turret of a B-17. It's minus 40 degrees. The oxygen mask rubs your face. You see German fighters approaching. You're used to your escort group vanishing into the clouds to chase glory. You prepare to die. But suddenly, you see a red-tailed Mustang nearby. He doesn't fly away. He weaves above your wing. The Germans try to lure him, dive, and feign retreat. But the red tail ignores them. He hangs there like he's tied to you. He waits for the moment the enemy comes within real range of the bomber. And only then does he strike. Short, hard, and he immediately returns to the formation. For an ordinary fighter, returning without a kill was a failure. For the Tuskegee pilots, zeros in the shot-down column often meant the most successful mission because all the bombers remained intact. Word spread across air bases like wildfire. White bomber crews began coming to their commanders with a strange request. Who is leading us today? If it's not the Red Tails, we don't want to fly. Racism is a luxury of peacetime. At 30,000 feet, when your plane is burning, you don't care about the skin color of the man driving death away from you. You only care that he won't leave you. The statistics spoke for themselves. Other escort groups lost an average of 46 bombers. The Tuskegee group lost only 27 in the entire war. For a long time, there was a myth that they never lost a single bomber. Historians later corrected this. There were losses. War is war. But even the real figures were so much lower than average that it seemed like a statistical anomaly. The Germans were furious. Their tactics broke against this wall of discipline. They called these pilots crazy because they refused to play by the rules of dogfighting. In the end, the Red Tails earned a unique status. They were called the Black Angels. This was the peak of their glory. But command knew that to end the war, they had to strike at the heart of the beast. They had to fly to Berlin. Berlin. For an American pilot in '45, the word sounded like a death sentence. It was Big B, the heart of darkness, the most protected place on Earth. To get there, you had to perform the impossible. The distance from bases in Italy to Berlin and back was 1,600 miles. For a fighter of that era, it was beyond the physical and mental limits of a human. Imagine being tied to a hard metal chair. You can't stand, can't stretch, can't even move properly. Now put that chair in a freezer at minus 50 degrees. Add a deafening engine roar that vibrates every tooth in your jaw, and make yourself sit like that for 7 hours straight, and all that time, someone is trying to kill you. On March 24th, the Red Tails received the order to escort a massive armada of bombers there. It was one of the longest missions in history. The takeoff happened in the pre-dawn darkness. Hundreds of engines raised clouds of dust. In the sky, an aluminum river formed, an endless stream of heavy B-17S stretching for dozens of miles. Mustang pilots took their places on the flanks. Hour after hour, only the hum of the engine and the crackle of static. Cold seeped through fur jackets. Oxygen masks bit into skin. But you couldn't sleep. A second of drowsiness, and you'd collide with a neighbor or lose formation. When Germany appeared below the wing, the sky changed. It began to be covered with black spots. This was flak, the pilot's worst enemy, because against it, you are powerless. You can't outsmart a shell fired from the ground. You just fly through the mathematical probability of your death. The Red Tails held tight to the bombers. Shards drummed on the skin like hail on a tin roof. Planes jumped from blast waves. Suddenly, in the formation of fortresses, fireballs erupted, direct hits tearing bombers apart. 10 crew members vanishing in a split second. But the fighters kept going. They knew once they passed the flak belt, the Luftwaffe would appear. Roscoe Brown, commander of one flight, scanned the horizon. His fuel tanks were half empty. Exhaustion came in waves. He expected to see the familiar silhouettes of Mi-109s. But what he saw made him wipe the fogged canopy. Ahead, at a great altitude, strange dots appeared. They didn't move like planes should. They didn't fly. They glided. In the recognition manuals the cadets had studied, these machines didn't exist. They had no propellers. And they left a strange, double smoke trail. Oxygen was running out. Fuel was on the limit. Ahead, glistening in the sun, approached a weapon that was to end the era of piston aviation. These were not just new planes. It was a technological jump. The German pilots in these machines felt like gods. They saw tired, slow American planes that had traveled 800 miles. To the Germans, it looked like a shooting gallery. Roscoe Brown pressed the radio button. Bandits at 12 o'clock. High. He didn't know yet that in a few minutes he would have to rewrite the laws of physics. Because running away from what was coming was impossible. Only one thing remained: to accept the fight on the enemy's terms. It was a moment that entered every textbook of aerial combat. The confrontation of two worlds. The Mi-262 didn't just fly. It sliced the air. German pilots used hit-and-run tactics. At such speed, they didn't need to maneuver. They simply flew through the bomber formation, pressing the triggers of their 30mm cannons, and vanished. Roscoe Brown realized if he just tried to chase the jet, he would lose. His Mustang was at its limit, but the jet was 100 miles per hour faster. Brown did what he was taught in Tuskegee. He started to calculate. He noticed the German pilots were too confident in their speed. After an attack, they went into a wide, shallow turn to come back for a second round. At that speed, the turn radius was huge, several miles. Brown didn't fly after the German. He started turning early, cutting the corner. It was a deadly maneuver. He pointed his Mustang at the spot where the German jet was supposed to be in 10 seconds. Imagine the scene. The German's jet engine is roaring. He feels safe because no one is in his rearview mirror. Suddenly, right in front of his nose, from a blind spot, a silver silhouette with a bright red tail emerges. Roscoe Brown saw the Me-262 filling his entire sight. He had one shot. If he missed, the German would just hit the throttle and vanish into the stratosphere. Brown pulled the trigger. 6 machine guns spat a stream of lead. In that same second, the German pilot heard a sound he shouldn't have, the sound of his own plane's metal tearing. Bullets shredded the left turbine. A flash of fire. The jet engine, the crown of Reich engineering, choked and began falling to pieces. The jet tilted and went into a steep dive. Roscoe Brown watched it until it vanished in the clouds. This was no accident. That same day, 2 other Tuskegee pilots, Earl Lane and Charles Brantley, repeated this impossible feat. 3 jet planes in one day. 3 technological miracles destroyed by men who, a few years prior, were considered incapable of even driving a truck. The physics of the fight were on the German side. No, the psychology was on the side of the Red Tails. The German aces were used to being feared. But the Tuskegee pilots knew no fear because they had already gone through hell before they even got to the front. When the news of the downed Me-262s reached headquarters, the generals didn't believe it. They asked for camera footage, but the footage didn't lie. On the grainy frames, it was clear. A good old propeller-driven Mustang was tearing the jet future of Germany to shreds. For the Luftwaffe, it was a crushing blow. Their last hope was vulnerable. And worse, it was destroyed by those their propaganda called the lowest level of humanity. After that battle, something happened that rarely makes it into official military chronicles. It was a quiet surrender of ideology that happened long before Hitler admitted defeat in his bunker. Imagine the state of a German ace. A man who had absorbed the theory that his blood and origin made him the pinnacle of evolution. And now he stands on the ground, looking at the smoking wreckage of his jet plane. He was shot down by a man in a piston machine. But the shock was not the technical loss. When information reached the Luftwaffe headquarters that the elite Red Tails consisted of those the Nazi propaganda called subhumans, a silence fell. It was a system failure. If a supposedly inferior race can outplay the master race in the sky using worse tech, then the entire base upon which the Third Reich was built was a lie. One captured German pilot asked, "Who were those people on the planes with red tails?" When he was told, he was silent for a long time, then said, "I didn't believe it was possible. We thought it was some secret guard, specially trained volunteers from Europe." He realized that the entire library of books on racial superiority had burned along with his plane. It was a humiliation deeper than a lost battle. It was the realization that you lost to someone you thought was incapable of even fighting. The Red Tails didn't just destroy engines. They destroyed the Nazis' confidence in their own exceptionalism. But there was another side. The irony was that the Tuskegee pilots were performing these feats for a country that still doubted their right to equality. When the Black Angels returned to their bases in Italy, they often saw through binoculars how white bomber crews waved their hands in gratitude. In those moments, a new understanding of what America was being born. At 30,000 feet, there was no room for prejudice. There were only those who cover and those who are covered. However, the war was ending. For the Tuskegee pilots, it meant the end of one battle. But they knew the main battle of their lives was not over. They had defeated the master race in the sky. Now, They had to return home and prove their victory to those who still kept that 1925 report in their desk drawers. They didn't know yet that their return would be the beginning of a new era, and that their red tails would become a symbol that could not be painted over or forgotten. May 1945. The roar of engines over Europe finally fell silent. On the decks of carriers and transport ships stood the pilots of the 332nd Group. They were returning as more than veterans. They were a living refutation of the 1925 document. Every medal shouted that the scientific reports on inferiority were just paper soaked in fear of change. But when they stepped onto the pier in New York, they saw the world hadn't changed overnight. Signs still told people where they could and couldn't go. This was the moment of double V: victory over fascism abroad and victory over injustice at home. Many thought that after the war, the Tuskegee pilots would be forgotten. But the opposite happened. The crews of those bombers, thousands of white guys from Ohio and Texas, went back to their towns, and they told stories. They told their mothers and friends about how the Black Angels saved their lives when the sky turned to hell. These stories couldn't be stopped. They broke stereotypes faster than any laws could. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It was the document that officially ended segregation in the American Armed Forces. The military became the first major structure in the U.S. where professionalism officially became more important than origin. And the foundation for this order was the record of the 332nd Group. The generals could no longer ignore the facts. Today, looking at modern jets, we often forget how it all began. But the story of the Tuskegee Airmen reminds us that war is a battle of will. They didn't just humiliate the Luftwaffe and their master race myth. They humiliated the very idea that a person's potential is limited by their skin color. They once painted their tails red so the enemies could see them. They wanted to be visible so the Nazi aces would know they were coming. But in the end, that red color became a beacon for the whole world. They made the enemies fear. They made the Allies hope. But most importantly, they made us all see in them what they saw in each other from the very first day. Humans. Aces. Heroes. The story of the Red Tails is not about planes and machine guns. It's about how skill and discipline can shatter even the most powerful ideology of hate. And every time you hear about an impossible success, remember the men who took to the sky against the whole world and returned as victors.